Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chill Like a Mother podcast. We are in May, which is Maternal Mental Health Month. We are here with Jodi, who is the author of Mommy Brain. If you are not already following her on Instagram or any of her other channels, please, right now, not if you're driving, go and follow her because the content that she puts out about the research around the changes in the brain during pregnancy and when we become mothers and that journey of matrescence is incredible. And I'm going to not introduce her. I'm going to allow Jodi to say a few words about herself.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction already. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to talk all things motherhood, parenthood, and the brain today, and mental health, because I do think it's World Maternal Mental Health Day in May. And I don't know how that all goes. I think every day should be Maternal Mental Health Day. So I think we can just go with that approach. I'm a neuroscientist. I have a PhD in neuroscience, also a master's in psychology. And I've been really interested in studying parenthood for a really long time, actually. So this was something I was interested in my undergrad days and before I ever thought I would have kids. So it's definitely not something I've done because I have kids. I do have kids, but I think it's really fascinating how we become mothers in particular, especially the whole thing, what happens to us when we're pregnant and postpartum physiologically is so fascinating. Neurobiologically, we're seeing these changes that are really, really interesting. But then also I've been learning more recently about all the social context and that interplay between the physiology, neurobiology, and then those social contexts that we're talking more and more about today. So I think a lot about that. But yeah, it definitely is my passion is to talk about how the brain changes with motherhood in particular, but also with fatherhood, because I think it's important that we acknowledge that everyone's brains can change when they become a parent in different ways, but everybody has everything they need in their brains to parent. I think that's important to know. So I'm happy to be here
Hmm.
and talk all things parental brain.
Amazing. In your research, what is the biggest shift that happens in the brain when we're shifting from non-parent to parent?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, I do a lot of my research in animal models, and we've been studying the brain of mostly maternal animals and also paternal, so fathers as well, for probably over 50 years. But I think today what's been really fascinating for us as humans is to see the research in humans come out more really describing these changes in the human brain, not to the detail of the what we know in the animal models, but giving us an idea of what's going on in our brains on a larger scale. And I think that in combination with what we already know from the animal models is really giving us a lovely picture of the complexity of changes that occur in the brain when we become a mother and a father as well. But I think for me, as someone who studies plasticity, so the changes in the brains in terms of the production of new neurons, let's say, or changes in the structure of neurons, what's been most interesting for me is this research that's come out talking about how the structure, as well as the function, but mostly this research showing that the structure of the brain across pregnancy seems to change. And in fact, decrease in size in many brain areas. And so this is something that's been found relatively recently and it's been replicated. It's very consistent. So most women across pregnancy, when they're pregnant, the majority of them will have very similar brain changes, which is this kind of fine tuning of the brain. There's a decrease in different brain areas that's normal and healthy and adaptive. And it seems to be related to an increase in sensitivity towards a child in the postpartum period. And so this research came out a few years ago and got a lot of press. It was research done in Spain as well as in the Netherlands by research groups there. But when people think of the brain kind of shrinking in size, they often think that this is a bad thing and that they're losing their minds. So this is actually to take it even back further as I started studying the maternal brain in the context of memory and motherhood and that whole idea of mummy brain or mom brain or baby brain. And so it's when this research came out with this, like, women's brains are shrinking when they're pregnant, everyone started to be like, that's why I'm forgetting everything. But interestingly, that research didn't show any memory changes and no relationship between these structural changes and memory changes. And so I thought that's an interesting point. So, we often think that that our brains are becoming mushy, I guess, and not working across pregnancy and the postpartum period. And we talk about that a lot. That's probably the most talked about thing with the transition to motherhood. When we talk about the brain and motherhood, it seems to always equal a dysfunction. But the research
Yes.
is actually gives a different story, that there's this fine tuning, enhancement, ability to rapidly learn how to care for the child. But perhaps this is at a trade off with other memory capacities potentially. But more so recently, I will tell you, I think it all has to do with mental load. I think our brains will do what they need to do if they have the environment that will facilitate that. So if you all of a sudden have a to-do list, like 1,000 things to do, or not sleeping well because you don't have support, you are early postpartum, so a lot of physiological changes. And yes, your brain is also changing and figuring out how to keep baby alive, right? And you don't have other people who are willing to step in to do that. Of course, your brain is going to pick and choose where it can devote its attention. And so then remembering where your keys are, remembering what you just read, that likely is not going to be important unless it's baby directed. And so this is an idea I've been thinking about a lot the past couple of years, is how does that mental load, that emotional and cognitive labor, play into this feeling of mom brain or brain dysfunction? And what really is it telling us about the brain? I don't think the brain is dysfunctional. I think we're just, I will say it here, maybe the society is a bit dysfunctional and how we support the role of mother specifically.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes. A lot of what I find with my clients, and this was true of my experience too, is that I felt completely blindsided by the realities of being pregnant and being postpartum. And I don't know that it was specifically that nobody was talking about it around me. I don't think that was true, because I had lots of people who became mothers before me. They went through the sleep deprivation and the mental health and the potentially intrusive thoughts and any of those things. It was that I didn't feel prepared for the realities of that. For those of you who know, I live in Alberta, and two of my family members are currently pregnant, and I didn't give birth in Alberta. I gave birth in Saskatchewan, and both of them got these textbook style books. One that is the 4 trimesters, the first 3 in utero and then the fourth out. And the next one is I think it's titled The Early Years. Anyway, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like my light reading. So can I borrow this book? And so I did. Jodi. I skimmed the first
who's
3
going to read a
quarters.
textbook when they're pregnant? I mean,
Like,
I just said we have so much to do and our brains
I
are
know,
already like, can't handle it all.
right?
And they giving out textbooks? Save us. Anyway.
Right. And
I mean,
also
it's really nice. I'm going to
this
say
is
it's
the
nice.
solution. Also, like, I take a step back and I'm like, this is the solution. Like, this is the solution to preparing people for the realities of becoming a mom. So,
Yeah.
so I skimmed the first 3 quarters of it just while I'm standing there. And because this is a lot of the information that I already consume and research that I read and things, I'm like, okay, yep. So I get to the part about mental health. In the first 3 quarters of this, what I imagine is a 500-page book, there's 4 pages on mental health.
Wow. Okay.
4 pages. And I'm not shocked by this. And yet I'm shocked by this.
Yeah. I mean, this is, yeah. I know what you're saying. You're not shocked, but you're shocked,
Yeah.
right? I remember touring a hospital, in fact, in Alberta, a new hospital, because I'm from British Columbia, but I have family in Alberta. And they had like a wing for cardiovascular issues in pregnancy, and there was a wing for something else. And then I was with a psychiatrist, and we are like, so where's the mental health wing? Or like at least office, right? Down the corridor. I'm not going to say a whole wing. I should say there was a corridor, and you'd go here, da da da. And then it's like, so where's the mental health like support office people? And they're like, oh yeah, we don't have that, but that's a great idea. We're like, okay. So I think that this is, I mean, we do know that mental illness is huge. Increased symptoms of depression, anxiety. More women are getting diagnosed with ADHD in postpartum period. There's a lot of struggles, right, with this transition to parenthood for various reasons. And I think, yes, it's lovely to provide some resources like the textbook, perhaps in a different format for many, because not many will have the time for that. But I think the idea, that's nice to see, but then there's that whole mental health piece that's missing. And I think this is the biggest struggle. And when I think of mental health, I think of the brain. Of course, it is
Yes.
composed of many things. It's not just your brain function, it's the brain slash history, current events, environment. There's lots of different factors, nutrients, all sorts of things can play into our mental health. And it's not one thing that's going to dictate that. But I did a review with colleagues in 2017. We published a review on the neurobiology of postpartum depression and anxiety. And this was specific to the research done in women at that time. And, if we talk about statistics, we know 80% of women or females, human females, will most likely give birth. Not all of them will mother. We do know that about 20% will struggle with significant mental health challenges. So, that's quite significant. And yet, when we did this review of the literature, there were about maybe 25 research papers that had been done looking at how the brain in the postpartum might be, what the changes might be in association with depression. And there was actually no paper at that time in 2017 that had specifically looked at postpartum anxiety and brain changes. And so this, I will say, perhaps not due to the lack of interest by researchers. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. I would say it's more so due to the lack of funding to support the research, at least at that time. Since then, we've started to see a real uptick in this interest around how parenting is associated with changes in the brain, and perinatal mental illness is associated with changes in the brain. And there's been more funding going towards that. But in 2017, when we wrote this review, we were actually shocked and disappointed, because this is something that's so significant that we talk about all the time in terms of child development, but to not actually have research devoted to understanding, the neurobiology of a mental illness in, parents. So it was quite shocking. And in fact, now we know fathers will struggle with mental health issues postpartum and even in pregnancy, about 10%. And I think there's only one paper that's looked at fathers' mental health, one or two now, and maybe a bit more, and how that is associated with different changes in the brain. And so we've really fallen behind in this area of research. And I will say that depression itself, outside of the perinatal period, and brain changes, that's been investigated. There's probably at least 1,000 or more papers looking at various aspects of brain function in humans and depression, but not in this perinatal period. And so I think that this is something that was, we really need to change, because we're often just looking at a parent, particularly a mother's mental health, so that we can understand the child's development. We're not looking at the two together, or even her on her own, which I would advocate more for these days than anything. Yeah, there's so much more we need to do to focus on improving the care of mothers in particular, but the family unit as well. But on that note, I also want to say, because often the narrative becomes, oh, if mom's ill, that's the problem. If mom's stressed, that's the problem. It's all mom, her problem. She's taking medications, that's going to be a problem. Like, she's the problem. I feel like it's often internalized. So I want to say that many women struggle. It's always, I will say, it is always a combination between a little bit of biology and a little bit of social factors, right? Or maybe it's more biology, maybe it's more social in some, but there's always the interaction between the physiology, the neurobiology, and the context that you live in and your past history. There's lots of different factors. So it's not just, there's not something wrong with you if you're struggling. It's most likely something that's not great about your environment.
Yes.
To a large degree.
Yes. And I I would agree with that. I'm a social worker. And so when I took that education, a lot of it was focused around what's happening in the environment for that person, right? Like they're presenting as this, whatever this is. And there's probably something in the environment or in their past or in their experience of being human that is contributing to that. Like you said, it could, for some people it's like a lot biology, and for some people it's a lot circumstance, or it's a lot lived experience, or adverse childhood experiences, or adverse adult experiences that contributes to that. I was working with someone when I first started my private practice almost 10 years ago now. And, she was presenting as anxious and depressed, and everybody was just like, she needs help and she needs help and she needs help. Well, we were working together for 6 months before she told me that her partner was an abusive, drunk asshole. And so it was like, no, this is not a personal problem that you need to fix. You're in an environment that is likely going to result in lower mood, more worry, hypervigilance, like intrusive thought, anticipating the next explosion.
Yeah.
And for years, I mean, this relationship was a long-term relationship and had been off and on and all the things. And she had internalized exactly what you just said, that it was her fault that she couldn't get her shit together.
Yeah, yes. And this is the narrative that I want us to kind of be aware of, that we internalize a lot, I think. And it's like, oh, if only I could do this, or oh, it's my serotonin's not working well, or it's like my genes, or whatever. Yes, maybe all of that is contributing, but it's not just that. I feel it's very rare that it would be just your biology. There's usually a lot of different factors that play a role. And so I think this is also something at least I think is quite hopeful, because then if you can piece these things apart when you're not feeling well, either, with a friend, with a therapist or whoever, then you can actually pull things apart and be like, oh, hold on a second, maybe, okay, I can maybe tackle that situation. There's cases where people will have thyroid hormone levels that are just not healthy, and that's one of the pieces to the puzzle of why they're not feeling well. Or low iron, or there's lots of different factors. Of course, relationship issues, history of mental illness in the family. Of course, that's going to play a role, but it's not the only thing. And so I think that this is really something we have to keep in mind. On top of, especially with mothers, I feel like there's just so much pressure to be a certain way that that expectation in itself is just a weight that we bear, right? And so that's really can be really heavy. It's just trying to figure out how to be a mom and live up to everybody's expectations.
Yes, yes. That like impossible parenting piece that Olivia talks about from Canadian perinatal mental health trainings. Her book was amazing. I think I read it in 3 days. It was like, I've never felt so seen in this, like in exactly what you described. And I want to circle back to what you said, Jodi, about the connection between the mommy brain and the mental load. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit then about mommy brain, which often many people will say it's related to memory dysfunction. And so the research, and I talk about this in my book, and I've written about it quite a bit in scientifically, and kept up on the literature, which is sparse again. 80% of women will be like, oh, I feel like my brain isn't working really well. And we have, I don't know, maybe 30 research papers on the topic. So it's really, I mean, it's growing as well, but we're really lacking a lot of information. But I will tell you a couple key points. One is, if you ask a mom how she feels about her memory, and so she's self-rating, she usually will say it's not very good. It's not, she's forgetting more, brain fog is a component, things like this. And these factors of how she feels about her memory often are related to things like how well she rates her sleep, for example, how often she's interrupted by her child. There's been a paper showing that moms use mommy brain to describe also isolation that they're dealing with. So they have isolation plus constant interruption. So of course you can't focus on a task. That's, if you ask moms to describe what they're feeling, this would be in general what the literature is telling us they're feeling. But if you have a mom come into, or a pregnant person come into the lab and do some memory tests, you're not seeing the same kind of deficit, or any deficit in many cases. So if they can come into the lab, do these memory tests, which are objective. So they're not, they're just taking a test and then getting a score. What generally the literature is showing is that there are slight deficits in things like verbal memory, so trying to find a word, and working memory, so remembering where you parked your car, maybe. Slight deficits. This has kind of been consistent in the literature. This comes out. But what's also interesting, and often we're in the research, we're looking for deficits, but one study a couple years ago came out and they were looking for enhancements in memory. And in fact, pregnant women have better memory for baby-related things compared to non-pregnant women, right? Which makes sense.
Yeah.
So the story is kind of this. There's another piece to it, actually. Before I conclude the story, I'll give you the next piece. But then you think, okay, so women are saying, I can't remember things. My brain is mushy. I forget things all the time. But then women come into the lab and they can do memory tests totally fine.
Right.
And it's not related to their sleep, at least like later in the postpartum and things like this. So then you're like, okay, so what's going on? I mean, you can't just be like, hey, your memory's fine. Stop talking like that. Because there's a reason she's saying this, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, when I was in graduate school at UBC, I was involved in a study where pregnant women came into the lab. They're pregnant or non-pregnant, came into the lab, did some memory tests. Then they had to go home and from home had to remember to call the lab in or mail something from home. So that was kind of a memory test at home, right? In the lab on the test, no differences. Everyone did the same. Didn't matter if you're pregnant, or you're not pregnant. Everyone's great at the memory test. From home, who doesn't mail in the brochure or call and confirm their appointment? The pregnant woman. So then as I think about this and as I see more research and talk about mental load coming out, I'm thinking, actually, what's going on in her home then, right? If she's in a quiet space, she's working great. If she knows her child's being taken care of, probably by a research assistant in the lab, everything's fine. There's no telephones ringing. She's allotted her hour to come. If this is great, she can do her stuff. So, but does she really have that at home? No. And so this is where I would love to see the research go, is really looking at what's happening in the natural environment, right? In terms of memory, because that's where I think you're going to see then the objective, like the memory tests will be probably, I'm guessing, a bit more similar to what she's feeling about her memory. Yes. Right? But the hopeful piece of this is if you have the time and the place to actually concentrate on something, you can do it. And that comes back to this mental load piece. Like, how much is your brain like trying to deal with? And so when you can just like, focus on just one or two things, your brain is still working great, right? But if you can't do that, of course, your brain's going to pick and choose what it's going to remember to do. This is how I think of it. I think of our brains like your brain should be a little bit baby too.
Yeah.
When you have a new child, it's not just all about the child. It really has to be about taking care of your brain in many ways.
Oh my gosh, this is just like you just had just the way that you described that. My whole brain went light bulb because hearing you say that in the lab, when the child is taken care of, there's no distractions, there's nothing in her environment that needs her attention, whether it's perceived or actual attention. She can pass the memory test or score positive, however that works. But then the take home piece is who's going to forget it? The person who has a million things going on, who takes care of everything, who does everything. And this part is fascinating to me because people will say, I'll be in relationship with people, in therapeutic relationship with people, and they'll be like, oh, I forgot to book my therapy appointment. Like 6 months will go by or whatever, and they won't have that. And they'll get back in and oh, I forgot to book it. And I said, but did you forget to feed your kids? Did you forget to register for them for swimming lessons? Did you forget to pack your partner their lunch? Did you forget to file your taxes? Probably not. Right, like,
yeah, exactly. We start to pick and choose, right?
Yeah.
What we have the space to do, essentially, what our brain has the space to do. We prioritize perhaps, but yeah, Yeah, it's so for me, I think there's also, I would love us not to think of our brains as a dysfunctional organ, especially as women and females, because this is a narrative we're often fed. Historically, we have been as well. Realize when our brain is mushy, when there's the brain fog, it probably needs something. And
Mm.
so, yes, maybe it needs more rest. Maybe it's more sensitive to hormones at this time or what have you. I'm not saying there's not a biological component here, but there's something it's needing, it's demanding attention. This is also how I think about things like depression or anxiety. Then I'm thinking the brain is demanding attention because it needs something more from you. So does it need more sleep? Does it need more B vitamins? Does it need to get outside? Does it need to be alone? Does it need to be with others? We could go through the list kind of thing, or even start at the basics, right? But I think that I tend to think of it as a signal to then take some time, if we can, or try to get someone to help us so we can take some time to figure out what our brain needs, right? Or give it what we're pretty sure it needs. Because sometimes you'll hear yourself be like, I'm just so exhausted. If I just had a day off or just had 2 minutes by myself, then maybe that's what you need. So, and of course, I will also say, okay, this sounds all very lovely and easy
Yes.
peasy, but I will also say that, of course, in cases and many situations where it's ongoing mental health struggles, I mean, there's lots of different options that are available. Medication is a great one as well. Maybe that's what your brain's telling you it needs, right? So I think that there's just different ways of approaching this, but with this idea of supporting our brain health, especially as mothers, and protecting it a bit more, but also having other people help us do that. It shouldn't be our responsibility solely to take care of our mental health. We need to do it with other people involved, or other people need to support us in doing that as well. So yeah, there's a lot going on
There's
when we
so
become
much.
mothers and parents.
Yes. And I hear what you're saying, and I will share this with anybody who will listen, is that there are about 1,000 good ways that you could take care of your mental health, your brain health, your physical health. And there's only going to be a handful that work for your reality, for your situation, for your environment, for where you live, right? Like there's on paper, it's like, yeah, take 2 minute break, or, just have that hard conversation with your mother-in-law or your partner, who, just like say the
Yeah.
things. It is not that easy. It is not that
No,
simple
and
for
that's,
most.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so for me, a question would be like, what do you think would be helpful? And that for me, if for some people it's really impossible, I don't know, they wouldn't know what would be helpful. But for some people, it really comes quickly what would be helpful. It would be like, oh, it would be really helpful if, I had better scheduled during the day for nap time, or I could go into work 2 days a week again, or whatever that might be. It could be really different for different people. But this is often where I start is, what do you think would be helpful? Because everyone can give you 1,000 things to try, and there's books about all the things you're supposed to do, and there's lists all over Instagram, the 20,000 things you should do first thing in the morning. I mean, I always made this joke with my husband. I was like, I think only single people do those lists. Like, nobody can do those lists. Like, nobody has time to like wake up at whatever 5 and then I don't know, whatever. Anyway, okay, I'm not going to get into my personal routine, but I will tell you, I prioritize sleep in my life, and that's a big one for me. That's really important. But I think you need to find what will work for you and what you've done in the past that have been helpful. And
Yes.
I think often pulling on that can be great. It's like, oh, I really used to love doing that. And like, oh, why don't we try it again? That would be awesome, right? So, like you said, just a few things that are tailored for you, but you probably know what they are. And if you don't, then you have 1,000 things to try, right? How fun is that?
And now that you've listened to this podcast, and if you're listening to it, especially out loud, Instagram is going to tell you, they're going to, it's the algorithm is now going to
All
be
right.
like, and here is your self-care list.
That's
Jodi,
right.
Jodi, tell me where people can find your book, and if you have any upcoming trainings, workshops, opportunities for people.
Yeah, so I will say you can find me on Instagram. Also, I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website, jodipawluski.com. You can find my book, A Mummy Brain, online. It's published from Demeter Press in English. It's also available in French from Larousse. It's on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, Cultura, depending on where you live and what you have access to. It should be coming out in Greek soon for any of your Greek listeners. So that
Amazing.
would be fun. I also have a podcast, Mommy Brain Revisited, and where I interview other researchers who study the parental brain. And so if you want to deep dive into some neuroscience research or certain topics, I have things ranging on there from mindfulness and brain changes in parenthood to really molecular changes in the medial-preoptic area across pregnancy and with researchers doing this research. So you can find that Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify and other podcast listening places. I don't know what their official name is. And I think that, oh yeah, and you asked about a course. Yeah, I'm offering a course through Canadian Perinatal Mental Health Trainings this fall. It's on the neuroscience of perinatal mental health, and we're going to be just deep diving into all the science of how the brain changes with motherhood, fatherhood, adoptive parents. I even talk a bit about grandparents, and then with different mental illnesses and what we know. So we cover things like depression, anxiety, psychosis, and then treatments and the treatments that are, what we know about certain treatments, whether it's therapy, interventions, group therapies, medications, what have you, and what we know about how they can alter the parental brain as well. So I'm kind of giving an overview of the literature on the neuroscience of perinatal mental health. And so that's available through the Canadian Perinatal Mental Health Trainings. It's going to be fun.
Amazing. And so that's going to be live. And then do you know if they're going to turn it into like a self-paced after you guys record it?
Yeah, so what it is you can do it self-paced as well during that time. For example, so I will give the lectures and Q&A will be live, recorded, and then posted. And so then you can listen to them. I think it's because the literature is constantly changing.
Yes.
It's not one you can just have self-paced all the time, I feel. So I go through and kind of update it because I want us to stay current as professionals with the literature because there's been some really interesting research starting to come out on different aspects of even, brain changes that I think are important. Yeah, but there is that kind of self-paced component. You can have access to it for a number of months, even afterwards, so you can catch up on things if you haven't been able to attend all the weeks. It's 6 weeks, once a week for 6 weeks. This time we did it last fall, it was a bit longer, but we condensed it this time. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to it and sharing the science.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jodi, for this amazing conversation. I hope as listeners, you got something out of it, especially that question of what would be helpful right now or in the near future. I think that is really an amazing reflection question. If you find yourself spinning or in an anxious spiral or stuck or like numb, what would be helpful right now or soon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank
Yeah.
you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And yeah, we could keep talking,
We
but we got to
could.
stop.
We really could. Thank you, Jodi.
Thanks.